A tense mood pervaded the federal courtroom in Dallas, Texas, as Judge John Carter pounded his gavel to begin the trial. Jasmine Crockett, a Democratic congresswoman and experienced defense attorney, stepped in with utmost confidence. She defended James Carter, a whistleblower who dared to speak out against Charles Lawson, a rich developer suspected of embezzling millions in public monies for personal benefit. Crockett expected an easy triumph with a recording and financial records in hand. She was used to pressure, from her days protecting the destitute to her current work as a legislator battling injustice. However, today felt different. At the defensive table, an unexpected figure appeared. Caroline Leavitt, the White House press secretary during the Trump administration, stood there, young but chilly. As the White House's special legal advisor, she assisted Lawson's legal staff, a crucial supporter of the conservative establishment. Her presence sent shivers through the courtroom. Crockett considered herself a representative in a courtroom, her lips twisting in scorn. She'd never met Levitt before, but the name was associated with Trump, which put her on guard. Before digging into the tale, leave a comment about where you're viewing from and remember to subscribe so you don't miss out on the newest news. The piercing bang of Judge John Carter's gavel resounded. The trial began in a federal courthouse in Dallas, Texas. Jasmine Crockett stood from the plaintiff's table, her curly hair carefully groomed and her gaze as keen as a razor. She straightened her blazer and strolled to the center of the courtroom, exuding the confidence of someone with experience in difficult legal battles. The audience grew hushed, and the reporters stopped murmuring. All eyes were on her. This was Crockett's moment. She knew it. Your Honor. Her voice boomed out loud and clear. Today I represent James Carter, a man bold enough to reveal Charles Lawson's apparent corruption. We have incontrovertible proof. She held out a little USB drive, the light from the window reflecting off it like a sign of justice. This video, caught in Lawson's own words, reveals him admitting to embezzling $5 million from Dallas taxpayers for personal benefit. Crockett looked to the defense table, where Charles Lawson sat with a serene demeanor and narrowed his eyes as if to calculate. She went on to say, "We also have financial documents, bank statements, and contracts proving the illegal flow of public funds into Lawson's private accounts. This is not guesswork, Your Honor. It is obvious as day." She placed the USB and a stack of documents on the table, her demanding glare fixed on Lawson and his legal team. Judge Carter, with silver hair and a severe countenance, nodded slightly. "Miss Crockett, proceed," he murmured, his voice level but laced with interest. Crockett smiled discreetly. She knew she had power, and it felt good. She had spent weeks preparing for this case, going over every line of the records and every second of the audio. Lawson was afraid that she would not be able to escape this time, but suddenly a sound echoed around the room. A tiny squeak from a chair and the click of high heels on the hardwood floor. Caroline Leavitt stood from the defense table, her small figure projecting a commanding presence. Lawson's legal team, led by Robert Klein, a middle-aged guy in a dark blue suit, looked at her, little astonished. Levitt didn't care. She took a step closer, carrying a tiny stack of papers, her gaze fixed on Crockett. "Your Honor," Levitt stated quietly and sharply, "I am Caroline Leavitt, White House press secretary, here as a special legal advisor at the administration's request. Before Miss Crockett goes any further, I'd like to see the legitimacy of this so-called proof." The entire courtroom shuddered. Crockett whirled around, her brows tightening firmly, as a wave of murmurs flowed from the back rows, with the press scribbling frantically. "Are you kidding me?" she said, unable to disguise her disgust. "You are Trump's spokeswoman, not a lawyer, and this is a courtroom, not the White House press briefing." Levitt did not flinch. Instead, she inclined her head slightly and smiled coldly. Miss Crockett answered, her voice as soft as water. "I do not need a legal degree to know that you are on unstable footing. Are you sure the recording is legal?" Crockett blinked, briefly disoriented. She had not expected Levitt to speak, let alone question her directly. Lawson grinned, his eyes widening as if he discovered a way out. His legal team, who had first been silent, began to stir, mumbling among themselves. Judge Carter slammed his gavel again. "Order," he said, turning his eyes from Crockett to Levitt. "Miss Levitt, if you have an opinion, express it plainly. But remember, this is a courtroom, not a political platform." Levitt nodded, but her gaze never left Crockett. "I'll clarify right now, Your Honor," she continued, her tone serene but filled with disconcerting confidence. "Miss Crockett, go ahead and present, but brace yourself because what I have to say will not be to your liking." Crockett squeezed her hands, her early sensation of power fading. She glanced at Levitt, a young lady with blonde hair and steely eyes, and recognized she wasn't dealing with just any opponent. The courtroom became silent, yet the air became as hot as a fire. The struggle had barely begun, and Levitt had delivered the first surprise strike. Judge John Carter slammed his gavel once again, his keen gaze scanning the courtroom. "Miss Levitt, make your argument," he urged. His tone was harsh, but he couldn't hide his interest over this unexpected involvement. Jasmine Crockett stood there with her hands still on the stack of paperwork and her gaze fixated on Caroline Levitt. She couldn't believe a press secretary, not a lawyer, would confront her in the middle of a courtroom. But when Levitt walked forward, confident as a warrior entering the arena, Crockett felt a chilly air blow in. Levitt clutched her little stack of papers, her voice low and crisp as a newly honed sword. "Your Honor," she started. "Miss Crockett describes this tape as indisputable proof. But I have to ask, is it legal?" She fixed her focus on Crockett. "According to the Federal Wiretap Act, 18 U.S.C. Section 2511, any recording in Texas must have the approval of at least one individual involved, if not both. Crockett, do you have legal permission for this recording? Or did James Carter record it without Lawson's permission?" The courtroom fell silent, save for the scrape of press pens on paper. Crockett blinked, little startled. She had diligently prepared for this case, but Levitt's inquiry turned a direction she had not anticipated. "This is evidence from a whistleblower," she said, her voice still powerful but hurried. "People who expose corruption, such as James Carter, are protected under federal law. This recording constitutes an exception." Levitt cocked her head, her chilly smile sprouting anew. "An exception," she said, her tone almost playful with her victim. "Miss Crockett, I'm afraid you're conflating whistleblower protection laws with evidence collecting procedures. The Whistleblower Protection Act, 5 U.S.C. Section 23-02, only protects Carter from retribution. It does not justify an unlawful recording. Do you have a court order for this, or are you relying on justice over procedure?" Crockett squeezed her fists, her claws sinking into her hands. She felt the gazes of the audience, the journalists, and Charles Lawson, whose smile became more prominent. "I don't have to respond to someone with no legal standing like you," she fired out, her voice rising significantly. "You're only a press secretary, not a judge or a lawyer." Levitt did not move, instead stepping closer and pointing at her papers as if they were a weapon. Miss Crockett remarked, "I don't need a law degree to read the law." Her voice is calm as water over stone. "And the law is clear. If this tape is made without legal approval or a court order, it has no place in this courtroom. I want its quick removal." A wave of muttering rippled from the back row. Lawson's legal team, who had been silent up until now, began nodding and murmuring among themselves. Robert Klein, the lead attorney, looked at Levitt with a mixture of astonishment and acceptance. Lawson crossed his arms, his eyes glittering as if he had seen the light at the end of the tunnel. Judge Carter lifted an eyebrow, his words piercing the air. "Miss Crockett and Miss Levitt present a significant matter. Have you get a response? How was this recording obtained?" Crockett took a big breath and tried to restore her calm. "Your Honor," she continued, her voice slowing as if she was considering each syllable. "Lawson confessed guilt during an internal meeting, which James Carter recorded. This was an emergency scenario and Texas law permits recordings in such circumstances to protect the public interest." Even as she talked, she could feel her argument faltering. She had no court order, which was the truth, and Levitt had used that weakness. Levitt shook her head gently as if she pitied her opponent. "Your Honor," she continued, "Texas has no public interest exemption as Miss Crockett just discovered. The state law is extremely clear. Except for a judge's order, all parties must consent. Crockett possesses no command or permission and so no valid evidence. I encourage the court to examine this before wasting any more time. Crockett felt blood pour into her face. She turned to Levitt, her eyes flaming. You believe you're really clever? She grumbled, her early serenity fading. You're merely Trump's puppet here to protect a corrupt criminal. Levitt did not respond quickly. She stood there, arms crossed, her gaze serene yet as keen as a sword. Miss Crockett, I'm not here to talk politics. Finally, she spoke, her voice low but clear. I'm here to make sure the law is followed, and right now you're breaching it. Judge Carter slammed his gavel again, this time with a forceful tone. Enough, Miss Crockett, I need a definitive response. Do you have legal permission for this recording? Crockett opened her lips, but the words got trapped in her throat. She looked down at her paperwork, then at Levitt, the young lady with steely eyes who stood there confidently as if she controlled the courtroom. For the first time that day, Crockett felt her base waver. Levitt had delivered her first strike, and it was harsher than anything she had ever encountered. The air in the federal courtroom in Dallas was as tense as a cracking thread. Judge John Carter slammed his gavel again, his stern expression fixated on Jasmine Crockett. Miss Crockett, I'm waiting for a response, he replied, his voice as firm as steel. Is this recording legally authorized? Crockett stood there, grasping the table's edge, her gaze shifting from the judge to Caroline Levitt, who had cornered her with a chilly sneer on her lips. She took a long breath, attempting to calm herself, but fury had been building in her chest since Levitt first spoke. Your Honor, she continued, her voice shaking slightly but remaining cool. I've emphasized that this is proof from a whistleblower acquired in an emergency to reveal malfeasance. The law supports justice, not criminals like Charles Lawson. Levitt crossed her arms, her gaze never leaving Crockett. Your Honor, she interrupted, her tone calm but as keen as a blade. Miss Crockett is evading the question. There is no court order or permission, and that is the reality. She may talk about justice all she wants, but the law is not based on emotion. I repeat, I urge that this recording be removed. Crockett turned back to face Levitt, her eyes blazing. You dare to call me a dodger, she hissed, her palm quivering with wrath. Miss Levitt, I've been in courtrooms like this since you were a child. Who do you think you are, teaching me the law? Crockett's outburst sent shudders across the courtroom. The reporters stopped writing, and Charles Lawson grinned, his eyes shining as if he were enjoying a good performance. His legal team, led by Robert Klein, exchanged delighted glances, but Levitt remained unfazed. She stood there, small yet commanding, as if Crockett's rage were merely a passing breeze. Miss Crockett? Levitt answered, her voice quiet yet apparent to everyone. I don't need to teach you the law, you've already failed yourself. Nevertheless, if you want to continue, show me your next piece of proof. I am curious how feeble it will be. Crockett felt blood rush to her face. She couldn't believe Levitt's arrogance, a press secretary with no legal degree daring to question her, a seasoned defense attorney with decades of expertise. She returned to the table, her shaking hands raising the financial paperwork. Fine, she muttered, her voice rising with rage. If you want to play, let me show you. Here are the bank records and contracts that show money moving directly from public monies to Lawson's pockets. $5 million is undeniable. She smashed the paperwork on the table, the sound resembling a declaration of war, but Levitt did not flinch. She walked forward, carrying a single sheet from her stack and scanning the statements like a hawk looking for prey. Your Honor, Levitt responded calmly. Ms. Crockett had just said contracts and statements. May I inquire if the subpoena for these papers was lawfully approved? Because I have a copy and it contains a severe fault. Crockett halted, her gaze drawn to her own stack. What flaw? She snapped, her voice breaking from astonishment. Levitt held up the paper, light streaming through to reveal a handwritten signature. This subpoena, she said, was signed by a court clerk, not a judge. In this instance, only a judge can authorize a subpoena under Rule 45 of the Federal Rules of Civil Procedure. Ms. Crockett's materials are invalid, and I urge their elimination as well as the recording. The courtroom erupted in murmuring. The reporters wrote rapidly, with some rising to get a better perspective. Lawson folded his arms, his smile bright as morning sunlight. Klein murmured to his colleagues, nodding in agreement. Crockett felt the floor quiver under her. You're making this up, she said. Professionalism is gone. She lunged toward the table, pressing her fist into the paperwork. This is a farce. Who do you think you are, a spokesman who will stand here and lie to protect a criminal? Levitt cocked her head, her expression cold. I'm not making anything up, Ms. Crockett, she responded. I'm only reading what you didn't see. You may verify it if you want, but I recommend you calm down. You are humiliating yourself. Order. Judge Carter yelled, pounding his gavel so fiercely that it rang around the room. Ms. Crockett, you need to restrain yourself right now. Ms. Levitt, please bring your proof here. Levitt took a step forward and handed the document to the court clerk with eerie composure. Crockett stood there, panting and clutching the table's edge as if to keep from collapsing. She glanced at Levitt, the young lady with blonde hair and steely eyes, and for the first time in her career, she felt completely powerless. Judge Carter furrowed his brow as he reviewed the page. He said, Ms. Crockett, in a slow voice. Ms. Levitt is correct, this subpoena lacks a judge's signature. Have you an explanation? Crockett opened her lips, but no words emerged. She glanced down at her papers, then at Levitt, who stood there as calmly as if she had just won a chess match. She'd planned everything, the tape, the paperwork, but with a few words Levitt demolished it all. Crockett mumbled as her voice faded. She couldn't do it, but the fact was right in front of her. Levitt wasn't just challenging her, she was winning. Judge Carter slammed his gavel again. I'll consider Ms. Levitt's motion, he added, his tone firm. Ms. Crockett, if you have other proof, please bring it, but I suggest you to remain cool. Crockett didn't respond. She glanced at Levitt, her eyes filled with rage and uncertainty. She had lost her calm, and the entire courtroom had witnessed it. The fight had erupted, and Levitt had just thrown her into an abyss with a sharpness no one anticipated. The federal courtroom in Dallas grew silent, interrupted only by Jasmine Crockett's ragged breathing reverberating throughout the area. Judge John Carter gripped the document Caroline Levitt had given him, his brow furrowed as he read each sentence. His gaze shifted from the document to Crockett, then to Levitt, a young lady who stood there with a calm demeanor as if the world was in her hands. Crockett grasped the table's edge, her nails sinking into the wood, attempting to regain control following her scream. But deep inside, she felt everything was slipping away. Miss Crockett, Judge Carter began, his voice slow but heavy like a hammer. Miss Levitt has stated that the demand for your financial documents was not approved by a judge. This is a severe situation. Have you get a response? Crockett took a long breath, attempting to control the wrath that was blazing in her chest. She turned to Levitt, her eyes filled with rage and anxiety. Your Honor, she started, her voice trembling but yet trying to be professional, this subpoena was issued in an emergency. A court clerk signed it to speed the corruption inquiry, but this does not decrease the evidence's worth. The fact remains, Charles Lawson embezzled state cash. Levitt cocked her head, her chilly smile sprouting anew. Your Honor, she said, her voice as soft as water on stone. Miss Crockett is attempting to rationalize an unforgivable error. The federal rules of civil process, including Rule 45, are quite explicit. In instances like these, only a court may issue a subpoena. A clerk's signature carries no legal weight, and she knows it. Crockett reacted swiftly, her voice shrill with rage. She is manipulating the truth. She pointed at Levitt, her hand quivering with rage. This is not about process, it is about fairness. Lawson is a crook, and I will not allow her to employ cheap techniques to conceal him. Judge Carter pounded his gavel, sending reverberations around the chamber. Miss Crockett, that's enough. He snapped, his gaze serious. I don't care about your feelings. I need legal information. Miss Levitt, go ahead. Levitt nodded and approached with disconcerting confidence. She lifted her hand as if she had Crockett's fate in her palm. Your Honor, she replied, her voice low but penetrating, I'm not just requesting the exclusion of financial documents due to a procedural error. I also want to listen to the recording Miss Crockett put so much trust in. I have a precedents to support my argument. The courtroom fell silent, all eyes on Levitt. She removed another sheet from her stack, the light illuminating the bold words. In the United States, she began with Nixon in 1974, her voice steady as if lecturing. The Supreme Court held that unlawfully obtained evidence, regardless of its value, cannot be allowed if it breaches the legal process. Crockett's recording has no authorization from Lawson and no court order, thus it is entirely worthless in this courtroom. Crockett's heart hammered. The United States came first, with Nixon. She mumbled, her voice wavering. She was familiar with the case, as were all lawyers, but Levitt, a press secretary without a legal degree, citing it so exactly sent shivers down her spine. Levitt did not stop. She turned to Judge Carter, her hard stare unwavering. Your Honor, Miss Crockett's recording and financial papers do not meet legal requirements. I seek their immediate exclusion. If Miss Crockett has no more valid evidence, I recommend that this trial be ended to prevent wasting everyone's valuable time. The courtroom erupted in murmuring. The reporters wrote frantically, with some standing to take shots. Charles Lawson crossed his arms, his smile as dazzling as the midday sun. Lawson's main attorney, Robert Klein, nodded to his colleagues, his eyes gleaming with admiration and satisfaction. Crockett stood shocked, as if smacked. She looked down at her paperwork before turning to face Levitt, a young lady who was small but incredibly forceful. "I can't," she mumbled, her voice faltering. She turned to the judge and attempted to object. "This is a conspiracy, Your Honor. She is manipulating the law to protect a crooked man." Judge Carter lifted a hand to signify silence. He said, "Miss Crockett," with a chilly voice, "I have heard enough. I'll examine the evidence and arguments on both sides." He looked at Levitt, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Miss Levitt, are you positive about what you've just presented?" Levitt nodded, unflinching. "Absolutely assured, Your Honor," she responded. "The law does not favor anyone, and I am here to guarantee that it is properly implemented." Carter groaned and laid the page down. He gazed around the courtroom, saw the press scribbling, the crowd murmuring, and Lawson smirking before returning his gaze to Crockett. "I need time to review," he added, his tone thoughtful. "But I must remark that Miss Levitt's reasoning is quite tight. Crockett, if you have no other proof that meets legal criteria, this will be difficult for you." Crockett felt the floor fall under her. She opened her lips, but no words emerged. She gazed at Levitt, her eyes full of wrath and anguish. Levitt stood there, arms crossed, her gaze placid but as keen as a razor that had just slashed through everything Crockett had constructed. Judge Carter slammed his gavel again. He declared that the trial will be recessed for 15 minutes. "I will make a decision after a careful review." The throng erupted in conversation. The reporters raced to the doors, phones lifted to photograph Levitt and Crockett. Lawson stood rubbing Klein's shoulder, his eyes shining as if he had avoided the Reaper's scythe. His legal team murmured and nodded in awe of Levitt's performance. Crockett fell in her chair, hands cupping her head. She glanced at the documents in front of her, which had previously been her ultimate weapon but were now simply meaningless paper. She mumbled, her voice hoarse. "She? How did she do it?" Levitt returned to the defense table, her eyes catching Crockett's with a little smirk. She did not say anything, but her eyes told all. She had turned the tables, and the world had witnessed it. This was the battle's culmination, not with emotion, but with razor-sharp reasoning and legal skill that exceeded all expectations. Levitt, a press secretary, had taken over the courtroom, leaving Crockett to confront only sad loss. The sound of Judge John Carter's gavel still resonated in Jasmine Crockett's head when he called for a 15-minute recess. The federal courthouse in Dallas exploded in uproar, with reporters pouring out the doors with phones and cameras poised, hoping to get a photo of Caroline Levitt, who had just transformed the trial into her personal stage. Crockett collapsed into her chair, hands holding her head and her vacuous gaze locked on the materials in front of her. The documents, once her supreme weapon, were now little more than fragments, useless, ripped apart by Levitt's few sharp words. She panted, attempting to organize her thoughts. "How did she do that?" She mumbled, her voice raspy and barely audible. She had encountered a variety of opponents during her career, including clever lawyers and rigorous judges, but she had never been defeated so quickly and decisively. Levitt, a press secretary with no law degree, had portrayed her as a failure in front of the world. Charles Lawson stood across the room, patting Robert Klein's shoulder with a huge grin. "That girl's a genius," he said quietly, his voice heavy with delight. Klein nodded, his eyes flashing with surprise. "I didn't expect her to be that clever," he said, staring at Levitt. She stood there, small yet authoritative, chatting to a teammate. That slight grin remained on her lips as if this win were simply another day at work. Crockett glanced up, his eyes distorted with wrath and sorrow. She noticed Lawson smiling, his staff nodding in agreement, and Levitt, the man who had ruined all she'd constructed. "She's not a lawyer," she said, stiffening her fists. "She's only a spokesman." "How does she know this information?" Linda Harris, a middle-aged member of Crockett's squad, approached and touched her shoulder. Linda urged Jasmine to calm down, her voice soothing yet apprehensive. "We can still save this, we just need to find a way to push back." Crockett offered a sour laugh. "What are you pushing back on, Linda?" She broke everything, including the tape and paperwork. She quoted United States versus Nixon as if she was born in a courtroom. She leaned back and rubbed her forehead. "I misjudged her, and now the entire world knows I failed." Linda sat next to her and looked at Levitt. "She is not a lawyer, but she is definitely well prepared," she continued with a melancholy tone. "She understood just where we were vulnerable. Perhaps the White House groomed her for this." Crockett repeated, "The White House," her voice harsh. "Trump and his associates. I understood this was a political matter, but I didn't expect them to play it so nasty." She noticed Levitt standing there calmly, speaking with Klein as if nothing had occurred. "She is safeguarding more than just Lawson, she is shielding their whole system outside of the press noise that has crept in." A reporter yelled over a phone, "The White House press secretary just convicted Congresswoman Crockett in a corruption trial." Caroline Levitt, a spokeswoman turned legal celebrity in a day, scribbled feverishly on a laptop. Crockett heard every word, and each one was a stab to her pride. She rose up, walked to the window, and looked out, trying to breathe and restore her calm. But Levitt's picture, those steely eyes and cruel smile, lingered in her thoughts. She said to herself, I was too confident. I assumed she was merely Trump's young lackey. But she's a monster. Linda approached, speaking gently. Jasmine, we haven't lost everything. The judge is currently reviewing. If we uncover any additional proof, Crockett cut her off, her voice hoarse. Other evidence? Linda, don't you see? She turned everything we had into a joke. I roared, pounded the table, and let her win on both law and spirit. She turned, her eyes filled with sadness. She's not just good, she's really good. Across the room, Levitt concluded her conversation with Klein. She looked at Crockett with unpretentious confidence. She didn't have to say anything, her success was evident. Lawson approached and expressed appreciation by shaking her hand. You saved me today, he replied quietly. Trump chose the correct one. Levitt grinned softly. I just did my job, Mr. Lawson, she responded, her tone calm. But her eyes spoke more. She knew she had gone well beyond that. She had transformed a legal dispute into a political victory, and the world was watching. Crockett observed the spectacle with her hands stiffening. She turned to Linda, her voice quiet but determined. She feels she has won, she explained. But I'm not finished. I refuse to let Trump's mouthpiece bring me down for good. Linda nodded, but her eyes showed concern. Jasmine said quietly, she's more than just a spokesperson. She is something far more deadly. Crockett did not respond. Instead, she gazed out the window, the gathering commotion of the journalists outside echoing in her ears. The words White House press secretary takes down Congresswoman in court reverberated through her mind like a sentence. She was aware that this failure would have far-reaching consequences, not just for the case but also for her reputation. Levitt had changed the atmosphere in the courtroom, and Crockett was now faced with the truth. She had lost, at least for today. However, a fire continued to blaze deep inside. She looked up, her expression hardening. She's fine, she whispered, but I'll be back. The setback stung, but it served as a warning, and Crockett was not one to quit up. The 15-minute recess went by in the blink of an eye, but Jasmine Crockett felt like it lasted forever. She stood in the corridor outside the Dallas Federal Courthouse, clutching a cup of water that she didn't drink, her faraway eyes fixated on the window. The press's uproar reverberated from afar, with headlines like White House Press Secretary Takes Down Congresswoman flowing through her thoughts. She had regained her composure, but the pain of loss lingered. Levitt had not only won, but she had also made Crockett appear like an amateur in front of the entire globe. Caroline Levitt strode out of the courtroom, her small form radiating control. She wore a basic black suit, her blonde hair sparkling under the hallway lights. Charles Lawson and Robert Klein trailed after, speaking to one another, but Levitt paid no attention. She retreated to a quiet spot, pulling out her phone with a focused focus as if she were reviewing White House texts. Crockett watched her, grasping the water cup hard. She wanted to look away and delete the name Caroline Levitt, but a weird pull drew her back. She took a big breath, placed the cup on a seat, and stepped over. Her sneakers clicked on the stone floor, each one a solemn statement of war. As Crockett neared, Levitt's icy gaze remained steadfast. Miss Crockett, she said, her voice even. I assumed you had already departed. Crockett paused a few paces away, arms folded. She stared at the young lady in front of her, the one who had demolished all she had created in the courtroom, and for the first time she was not angry. Instead, she witnessed an obvious reality. You're okay, she responded, her voice quiet but clear. I don't like to say it, but you are really excellent. A real legal genius. Levitt angled her head, a little grin flaring and then vanishing. She slid her phone into her pocket, her gaze fixed on Crockett. Thank you for the compliment, Miss Crockett said calmly yet confidently. But I am not here to be praised, I am here to win. Crockett emitted a harsh chuckle, but this time without contempt. I see that, she responded, her tone stern but serious. I assumed you were merely Trump's puppet, a mouthpiece with a few nice phrases, but you proved me wrong, horribly wrong. Levitt did not answer immediately once. Instead, she remained there with her arms crossed, her eyes scanning Crockett as if assessing an opponent. You are not the first to misjudge me, she replied finally, her voice low but sharp, and you will not be the last. Crockett nodded slowly, her expression hardened. I lost today, she remarked, her voice lowering, but not because I am inferior, but because you were so darn amazing. I'm not sure where you got it, but the way you cited United States v. Nixon and identified the subpoena issue is alarming. Levitt smiled gently, the first sign of warmth in the day. I learned on the job, she explained. When you work for President Trump, either you know everything or you're crushed. Today was an ordinary day for me. Crockett stared at her with an unsaid reverence in her eyes. A usual day, she said, her tone thoughtful. If today is typical for you, I do not want to witness your greatest day. Levitt gave a gentle giggle, a fleeting sound that relieved the tension. You will find out, Miss Crockett, she murmured, her eyes gleaming. Because I have a feeling this won't be our final meeting. Crockett nodded, her arms relaxed. You're correct, she said, her voice firm and determined. Next time I will not let you win so easily. I learned my lesson today and will not forget it. Levitt did not respond, but her eyes said it all. She embraced the challenge. They stood there, looking at each other in silence, a mutual respect developing between two competitors. Crockett, with her extensive expertise and passion for justice, and Levitt, with her acute instincts and unwavering allegiance. They were two sides of the same coin, opposing yet equal. Linda Harris's footsteps resonated from afar, disturbing the silence. Linda yelled, Jasmine, we need to get back, her voice concerned. Crockett nodded as the judge prepared to decide, but her gaze remained focused on Levitt. See you around, Miss Levitt, she murmured, her voice quiet but full of meaning. And next time I'll be ready. Levitt grinned, confident yet not arrogant. I'm looking forward to it, Miss Crockett answered. Then she turned and walked back to Lawson's legal team with a cool stride, as if their disagreement were only a minor part of her day. Crockett watched her leave, her fists clenched. She looked to Linda, her eyes full of new purpose. She's a genius, she added quietly, her voice full of hate and respect, but I'm not going to let her win again. Linda nodded, but her eyes were worried. Jasmine, she murmured, isn't simply a genius, she's the most formidable opponent we've ever fought. Crockett did not respond. Instead, she strode into the courtroom, head held high, the fire in her breast reigniting. Levitt had won today, but their war had only just begun. Crockett promised she would never lose again. The federal courtroom in Dallas became silent as Judge John Carter returned, ordering to exclude Jasmine Crockett's evidence and postponing Charles Lawson's case indefinitely. Caroline Levitt exited the courts with a serene air, her win protecting Lawson while also confirming her position in the Trump administration. The journalists rushed her, but she simply smiled and went away, creating the impression of a rising legal star. Crockett returned to Congress, her stare as stern as ever. Today's loss was both a scar and a spur. She sat in her office, flicking through paperwork, and whispered to Linda Harris, next time, I'm not letting her win. The fire within her grew stronger, ready for the next struggle. On White House TV, Levitt appeared in a news briefing, answering tough questions with a confident smile. I just finished my task. Her eyes glittered as if she could already anticipate her next confrontation with Crockett. Their war hadn't over, it had only just begun. The narrative of Jasmine Crockett and Caroline Levitt's judicial battle exemplifies the division and harsh competitiveness in today's American culture, particularly in the political and legal realms. In modern America, where Democratic and Republican principles sometimes conflict fiercely, the battle between Crockett, a progressive senator fighting corruption, and Levitt, Trump's sharp conservative press secretary, represents an ideological confrontation. Despite having no law degree, Levitt outmaneuvered Crockett with razor-sharp arguments such as invoking United States President Nixon or identifying the subpoena mistake, demonstrating how knowledge and preparedness can outweigh traditional experience. This reflects a reality in America where individual talent and flexibility sometimes trump reputation or position. This story teaches us not just to prepare carefully, but also not to underestimate an opponent based on their look or function. Crockett lost because she rejected Levitt as a spokeswoman despite her competence. In American life, from boardrooms to community discussions, you may encounter Levitts who defy stereotypes yet constitute a serious threat. Instead of allowing emotion to take control, like when she pounded the table and shouted, Crockett taught us to keep calm, analyze your opponent carefully, and always have a backup plan. Modern American life necessitates adaptation and appreciation for others' latent abilities since, as Levitt shown, triumph comes not from titles but from skill and determination. Don't forget to subscribe to see who will be the next courtroom genius. Thank you for joining us. We'll see you soon with even more exciting legal drama.